Hi everyone. So I've been asked to give a presentation today about some of the barriers I've faced as a deaf person in society. And the reason is because, some of you perhaps who are deaf and young have worried perhaps about future career possibilities. And so I'm here to give you my experience today about how to overcome those barriers. So I actually went to a mainstream school myself, and there really wasn't very many deaf people at all. So you're quite lucky that you've got deaf children around you at school where you can communicate with, because I didn't have that experience at all. I used to have to write things down and show them, and then they would write messages back to me. I didn't have that experience. So, you don't have that experience, but I did. So it could be quite frustrating. Anyway, after then, I went to Exeter Royal Academy for Deaf Children. And that's where I was immersed into a fully sign language, learning environment. And the college was really supportive of me. And they would provide interpreters so that I was able to have access to full information. And therefore I didn't need to write things down anymore. I realised that was rubbish. I could access things through British Sign Language, which meant that they were able to match the person speaking, and the person interpreting for me was able to match what I was saying. And just found that the communication was a lot smoother. So always remember that you have access, and it's your right to have an interpreter. So please don't be afraid to ask for an interpreter. But you might be wondering who pays for an interpreter. Well, you're actually very lucky now, because the council and the government will pay for an interpreter nowadays, and they have budgets allocated for that. And colleges will use that funding in order to pay for interpreters. So perhaps when college finishes, just remember that there'll be the council that will provide that for you, or the council will provide an interpreter for you. And there's funding available. So when I finished college, I went to Hertfordshire University and studied graphic design on computers. And a lot of the time what the lecturer would say would go over my head, so therefore it was important that I had access to an interpreter. But I definitely met some communication barriers at university. There were some barriers that happened. There were some interpreters that I would come to. Sometimes the interpreter wasn't available to come. But I would always make sure that it was important for them to come to the lectures, to make sure that there was always one, we had that one-on-one connection, so I was able to understand the lecturer. But when there was that one-on-one, sometimes I had to make sure I had to book an interpreter in advance so that I had that support. But it took some planning to arrange that. So the university also planned an art exhibition in London, but they didn't have an interpreter booked, which meant that when they turned off all of the lights, it was really difficult. So when they turned off all of the lights, it was difficult to see an interpreter, so it was better to have an interpreter available, which they had spotlights on, but because they didn't have that, I ended up just falling asleep. So I did 2 years at university, and then I went on a work placement. And I was applying for lots of different jobs during that placement. And I was wondering, how am I going to be able to cope? How am I going to make phone calls in the work placement because I am deaf? And I was wondering about how I was going to communicate during this work placement. But then I actually realised that because I was going to be doing a graphic art degree, it meant that I wasn't actually going to be on the telephone that much. So I realised that I was going to be involved in a very different setting. So I changed perhaps my perspective, and I decided to go to Bristol University because they had deaf studies being taught there, and that I could become a teacher of the deaf. And so now that's what I've been doing now, where I've become a teacher. And I got qualified at Bristol University. So perhaps you might think, yeah, Bristol University, I didn't need an interpreter there because everybody in the department signed. All of the staff could sign, all of the people that were learning sign language could sign as well. And there was a lot of deaf people employed as well, which meant that it was a fully immersive signing environment. And then got a job as a deaf and blind development officer. And within that role, I would support people who were deaf and blind and help them to integrate into society. So I would work with the council and a variety of people, and I would need interpreters for that. I would also have to ask for funding from the government, and we got that from an organisation called PAT, and that means it's a Placement Assessment Centre, testing centre. And we use ATW, which stands for Access to Work. So using the funding from Access to Work would fund this PAT exercise. And so it's important for me to understand the needs of the people that I was supporting. Obviously it meant that within my role I wouldn't be able to use the telephone. And obviously we didn't have technology. There was the old-fashioned telephones that we were given, like an old-fashioned Nokia phone. It was like a text, which meant that we were able to send faxes and receive faxes through this phone. And back then it was an amazing resource. And then now, perhaps you all use emails, and emails came into play. So that really changed my role a lot of the time. But we also had technology such as mini-coms as well. Also had pagers, which was good for alarms, such as like fire alarms and so on, which meant if a fire alarm was going off or there was a sound, it meant that my pager would go off, which meant that I could leave, would need to leave. And so that would be my role, where I would meet clients and organise supervision for them, and would use interpreters. So when that finished, I became a health and support worker. So as I said, the way that I would communicate with the outside society, it would do a lot. I would bring technology with me, such as mini-coms, to make sure that we can secure funding and so on, and make sure that I secure bookings for interpreters, making sure that I had plenty of access to be able to pay for the expenses for interpreters and so on, in order for me to do my job. And now I work in the sensory support service. And that's next to the RNIB. So I work at the RNIB in Bristol City Centre. And that's a room in part of the council. And so they have in-house interpreters, which they have employed there, which I'm able to use. So moving on from PAT, they introduced the Access to Work, and Access to Work was a lot more smooth, which meant that I didn't really need an assessment so much. What we would do is they would assess how many hours that I would need, which meant that before somebody would have to come and give me an assessment. But then now on Access to Work, I just need to show how many hours I need for an interpreter and to outline my job description. Now, obviously my English isn't very good, so what I would do is, I can write emails and so on, and then pay for an interpreter to come to check my English. And then that's why I have to explain all of these hours are needed in order to receive the amount of hours to pay for an interpreter. And you don't need to worry about working full-time or part-time. You just make sure that you can apply up to, so it's £43,000 which has been allotted, which means that you can use that money to pay for full-time interpreters. But it's actually, you might think that's a lot of money, but it's actually not enough. Because if I'm going to training, it means that I would need to pay for 2 interpreters. I mean, paying for 2 interpreters for a lot of the time means that that budget actually runs out pretty quickly. Which means then I'm not allowed to do any of my other day-to-day jobs. Which means I have to apply and campaign a lot of the time. You know, that's why we go to London and do a lot of the marches. You know, in March 2008, the government actually agreed to increase it from 40,000 to 47,000, which meant that it relieved a little bit of the stress, so that we had more money to be able to secure funding for interpreters. It was actually really interesting because the whole government funding issue, there was a lot of government cuts. I really don't understand how that works. It was like, every £1 we'd given, we'd have to pay back £1.20. And just access to work really just didn't work with all of the cuts that they've done recently. And so these interpreters for training courses, as I said, within my everyday life, within my job as well. And access to work will make sure that they will pay for an interpreter. But what they won't do is they won't pay for a job interview, which means that you have to go to the job centre, and if you say to the job centre, then it's their responsibility to provide you with an interpreter. Whether that will be the same within the future, I don't know, because obviously there's a lot of caps and a lot of cuts going on, so it's quite potential that it might change. So the future's a little bit unknown, but I would hope that whatever your dream job is, we'd hope that you'd be able to achieve that, because if you carry on, there's a lot of support that's out there for you, and people are campaigning at the moment to stop the cuts. Perhaps some of you might think about, worried about not working and so on, but just think that there is access to work opportunities, access to work out there so that you can have the support available. So I think we've covered everything today about access to work. I wish you the best of luck within your future careers. Please remember that if you have any questions regarding access to work, then you can go online to find some more information available on there. They have some frequently asked questions, and there's lots of things available on there, plenty of information in order for you to understand what it is. And if you don't understand what it is, then just know that you just have to ask. It's your right to ask for an interpreter. It's your right to have equal access. Anyway, thank you very much for asking me to come today. I know that your head teacher perhaps you're a bit worried about your future career opportunities. So it was nice for me to come along just to be able to let you be aware that there is support and there is access out there for you. So thank you very much for allowing me to come along today. Take care.